welcome to the 2010 BOC Heritage Trust Lecture and Seminar. We're delighted that you supported us and attended today. I hope you really enjoyed looking around the museum, and we hope you'll be fully absorbed and enjoy what we're going to come out with this afternoon with all of our speakers, and the opportunity. We feel that it's not just a lecture, it's a seminar where you have the opportunity to contribute any information or personal experiences that you feel would be constructive and other people would like to hear about our subject matter, Bristol's car division, the racing 450s and the other users of the Bristol 2-litre engine. But before we start, the Bristol Owners Club Chairman, Jeff Hawkins, would just like to have a few words.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. History is what we make of the past, our interpretation of what happened. Now, if you'll indulge me for a minute, I may sound as if I've gone off half-cocked, but there is importance in what I'm about to try and put over. What, for instance, do we know about Cleopatra? Was she the lustful queen portrayed in many cinematic epics, lover of two prominent Romans? Or was she the astute politician, striving to do the best for her country? Much of what we know comes from non-contemporaneous accounts, given from a Roman point of view, spin if you like. There are many odd stories to be found on the internet about Bristol cars. Stories that are picked up and reused as if they were true. You could easily form the impression that the 400 is just a BMW and that Bristol cars ceased manufacturing many years ago. Today is not about spin. The Heritage Trust is doing important work in collecting stories from those who were around at the time and recording them before it's too late. It is researching and collecting material of the time to properly understand the background as to what, why and when things happened. So we're not in the position where we don't understand our history. This important body of work will eventually come together in one place for all of us to have access to. This is the third lecture in what I hope is hoped will be a long series put on by the BOCHT. Today's lecture by Christopher Balfour will set out the history of the Bristol 450 racing cars from a period in time that some of us have forgotten and some have never known. You can be assured that it has been thoroughly and rigorously researched, and at the end I think you'll have a more accurate picture of the history of the 450 than you do of Cleopatra. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That's a nice lead up to our main speaker, Christopher Balfour, who will tell you about the whole scene during the whole 50s and early 60s of the Bristol car division.
Hi, I haven't ever used this stuff, so I'm going to start off a little bit more informally, and you can say if you can't, yeah, we'll go back to it. Now, the first thing is to thank Stuart and Martin Ashman, who were absolutely delighted to be here, and they are the sons of Ted Ashman, who is responsible for us being here, and indeed for me being able to make the book much more relevant. Bill Lawson, Anderson's daughter, is here, and he says he has 1,000 images from Ted Ashman, and we're just going to show you a few of them now. And Stuart, do you know what that is? Stuart has just produced this, and it is so vital because everyone has always thought that red leather upholstery in the 450 is correct. But if you look back in the bulletins, you'll see that when Peter Wilson, one of the drivers, came to one of the shows, he said, no, it's brown. And that is original brown leather from one of the other 450s, which has been on Stuart's, I can't see where Stuart is, been on Stuart's garage wall for a very long time. So thank you very much indeed for showing us real history. And I'm extremely glad. That he hasn't bought his unicycle, which he wanted to, or he'd have a septuagenarian speaker falls off unicycle. Anyway, now I've been asked to direct this to those who are not fully knowledgeable, but I know there are a lot of experts here, and please forgive me if it's tedious, and please interrupt and come in. I've asked to bring you in as much as I can. We'll see how it goes. How many of you were at Le Mans, or Spencer, is it Russ? 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 Yes, it's not Reeves, it's Russ. How many of you were at Le Mans or Russ in 53, 54, and 55? Was anybody there? No one was there. Say what you like. Too young. Anyone was Sid is, where is Sid? Sid was there at base camp, but am I right that he wasn't actually there at the news? I followed this from afar, because I was then doing national service, of all things, in Libya, and you'll see some motors there, which you might look afterwards. The Motor magazine was right before the autumn came on, and those very magazines were posted to me in Libya, and I pored over all these results. Alas, there was no 2-litre outside the office in this, though I've since learnt that there was a 2-litre in Benghazi. I just had to make do with a Fiat Cinquecento. It was our luck, our extreme luck, that in December 1968 we saw an advert for a 400, and we also had 370 of it. Can I not swing it? No. You may not be able to keep it, I don't know. But we also had 370 quid available. And I've looked at my diary. Oh God, I've got something else here. That is Martin Ashman. He's just produced it in that car in the 1960s. So have a look at it later. Martin, that's right, isn't it? Yeah, there you are. Would you like to have that from them too? And I found in the diary that we visited Filton on the 2nd of January 1961. And there I was introduced to Ron Radford, the foreman of the service department, to Eric Story, the manager. I think Donald Stock had either gone or was soon going to go to Trignell from London. And I was told that our car, AHT, actually belonged to Sir William Vernon Smith. Later, I realised that this was just 4 months only after George White purchased Bristol cars from Bristol Sidney. This is recounted in the book, but it was only just after that that Tony Brook came in. George White purchased from Bristol Sidney, and there had been profound changes in the previous years. In '59, it had become a subsidiary of Bristol Sidney, and all the evidence I found shows that they were absolutely happy to close the company if no one came forward. So that's why we're so grateful to George White. In '56, it was a separate company of Bristol Aeroplane, following Reginald Vernon Smith's takeover of the chairmanship of the parent company. And that, 10 years before that, it was very, very different. It was the car division of the Bristol Aeroplane Company. Now, Martin, Michael, you are an accountant, and you might like to come in here, because it seems to me that there were losses in the early years. This is entirely acceptable commercial practice. They were obviously used for tax, put against aviation, other people, other parts. And I've tried to get the accounts from the company's house, but it's quite impossible. I mean, Martin, is anyone else's view that, in fact, those first 10 years were not very profitable? Yeah, and everyone else. I mean, was anyone else about who remembers that? No, it's struggling. And it's Stanley, George White's father, was still managing director till February '52. And he was fully supportive of his son George. And this is terribly important, but he was completely supportive. In 1952, you'll be aware of this, I'm sure, the principal races were for Formula 2. And till then, as James Trignell is going to tell us, the main customer was H.J. Aldington. But in October '51, to quote Doug Nye, quoting John Cooper said, "The best available 2-litre was the Bristol. Father and I went to see the Bristol people. George White was managing director. Could we have an engine? The answer was yes." At the same month, it's on record, Leslie Johnson, the RA, also asked for an engine. So from January '52, the racing department was set up at Filton with Percy Kamish, Stan Ivaney, and in February '52, there is a picture in the autocar of the Cooper Bristol driven by John Cooper on the Filton runway. So they moved pretty quickly. They got the engine in October '51, and that car was running January '52. So now we move over, if I can make this work, to what we've got here. Now we press that, don't we? Yeah, and that. Now, how many of you know who that is bending over with the pipe? It wasn't lit. I can't believe this. Who was that? No. You haven't read the book, have you? That photograph's in the book. Come on. Bending over a Cooper Bristol. And this is the answer to Michael Barton's query about was the factory support. Bending over is who?
No.
It's Eric's story. An uncle figure to me, so helpful to all of us who were new owners, marvellous. And that is his support. Unfortunately, his wife died, he was a widower, and so at weekends he used to happily go down and help. He drove a Hillman Imp. It was probably the best Hillman Imp in the country. He had his way, it would be a very good car. Or one of the Bristols. And there he is, bending over Mike Hawthorne's Cooper Bristol. As far as I can gather, they were not, that was not a 6-port head. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was the June '52 meeting in which Mike Hawthorne had done extremely well earlier, and in the June one, he won again. And there's Eric looking after it. Right, so we go back to... Now, you must know who these people are. On the left, George White. So George White would go on Cooper. Now Dave has said to me, Dave Allen, that he thinks, only just see, but he thinks that that man is John Dennis. Any advance on that? Who was Tony Cook's mechanic. And that, the next one, I don't know. Over in the background, you can see 2 401s. They've just won the touring car race at Silverstone, and the 2 401s and the 400 behind. They were driven by Tony Cook and Salvadori, and so the fact that John Dennis was there, who was Tony Cook's chief mechanic, makes sense. Now, I just want to say a word about George White, because to me, is it easier if I talk through this, or is it? Yeah, it is. So I'll have to stick to this then. Now, George White, I was very fortunate to meet him just once. When he started Bristol Cars, he had 10 years on the shop floor. He really was a hands-on engineer. He was really loved by people in the workplace because they had all got to know him. So that when he started Bristol Cars, people wanted to work for him and did it readily. He, in a way we need people like to say that today, he went to Cambridge, saw all the theoretical stuff, didn't like it, and asked to go back after the year to the factory. And for 10 years, he was working away in the factory. And now we move on to, you obviously know what that is. Yeah, that is the ERA. Now, through the first part of 52, as far as I can work it out, they were concentrating on engine development for Fraser, Nash, Cooper, and others. James and Spencer will go into some of these details. They were working on mixture, on flow, on timing, all to produce a reliable engine on French fuel. And what we don't know is at what stage they decided to go to Le Mans. This is in the early part of 52. What we do know is that in October 52, they purchased this machine. Now, a lot has been written about it, that rather dismissively, that it hadn't done very well. But it, in fact, if you look up all the records, a lot of the problems were engine, and others were just purely bad luck. It was cannoned into a chicane at Goodwood, and then the next year, next race, they found that a crack, which they hadn't seen, was marked up the steering, except 2 races it didn't work. Nothing to do with the deficiencies of the machine. But it was in, let's say, in October 52 that they actually purchased it. Now, how many of you know about Leslie Johnson? Charles, yes, exactly. And he's one of these, again, British entrepreneurs of that time who just did so much. You know which of that is Leslie Johnson? Leslie Johnson on the left, Mike Hawthorne again at a good meeting, and a director on the right. Leslie Johnson has been sort of, his memory has been cloudy because he died very young. He had got all sorts of problems when he was young and had a heart attack. And this is why he had to give up. The story goes that he was in the team for something Talbot's called 54 Monte Carlo Rally, and he had a heart attack just at the end. And he stayed with the car so that Moss and Scannell won the team prize. And the fact that he wasn't taken straight to Monte Carlo Hospital affected him, and he died shortly afterwards. But he had, his father had been, had a furniture shop. He then, just before the 39 war, developed a furniture factory which was extremely good, and then with this money he purchased ERA. And he so obviously knew what he was doing. Now that was taken from a motor and is the rear axle. You can see, right, that is the A-link, which had been changed. David Hodgson, who designed it, had originally got it at the top, and then it was Bristol and Jack Channer who suggested that they changed it round and the links, the upper links went up there, A bracket was down here. Very long half shafts, and David Hodkin, when he talked about it, said that half shafts as long as that decrease the angularity, and you do this by having the universal right at the end here. What was really good about this chassis, and Bristol, and they had worked with it, they'd seen it, it had probably come out of the factory, their engineers had gone up to work with David Hodkin, they knew it was good. So when Leslie Johnson had to sell, because he couldn't go on, George White, I think, saw that this made sense as a good chassis. It had a low centre of gravity, very good suspension, and they obviously felt that they could turn it into something. It was in October '52. Now, I sort of thought a lot about this. It's largely supposition, but what was in George White's mind? Was it that he realised that with his father no longer in command, that things were going to change, money wouldn't be so easy? Did he then say, come on, let's have a crack at Le Mans? Did he then realise that in the time that he had, he couldn't possibly put together a new chassis? The 2 litre was going to be very heavy. This was available. Could it be the basis of a car for Le Mans? And shortly after they purchased it, George White announced at the motor show that they were going to go for Le Mans in '53, which was only 7 months later. That shows the universal with the wheels that Bristol did, and it incidentally made it easy to change the half shaft. That is the chassis of David Hodkin's chassis, changed by Bristol into steel. It was originally magnesium, and Bristol turned up with that and made it actually almost the same weight as magnesium. Stiff yet light. It's beautifully done. We assume that it is under there. What people have checked, and David said this morning that in fact they've been run with magnet, and that is a steel chassis, because people have wondered whether it was magnesium. That is a steel chassis. That's magnetic. Bristol's probably weren't so worried about the engine problems, because they knew at that stage that their own engines were still imperfect. There's records of Conrad's braking and other things happening, which James will probably talk about. So would anyone like to come in at this stage, on this stage of the development?
So just one particular focus then that's becoming apparent.
Yeah.
Bristol's were aiming for the long distance competitions market rather than sprint type
Yes.
racing.
Yes.
So that would have coloured their thinking on engine development. Do you think it coloured their thinking on chassis development at all?
I think chassis development was that it just wasn't possible, having taken the decision to go to long distance, to produce a chassis in the time they had. This was available, let's have a go at it. Now this is some of very many photographs of the construction of the body. A very light frame, the old style wooden horse on which they did the aluminium panels, and then putting the aluminium onto the frame. Now you can pretty well count the three there. this is again a debatable point, and I think we'll be able to clear that up later. That just shows the roll bar going up into the roof and the strong bulkhead behind the seats, which gave a lot of strength to it all. And there in May 53, barely a month before the war, is one completed car. Now, it's on record that Sid, he probably doesn't want to come in, but Sid actually drove this car, one of the first or one of the first to drive this car in the early morning on the runway. Remember, 3 weeks before the war. A few details of it. That is the oil filler, and you can't actually see now, the petrol tank is there, the filler, and the petrol tanks have been moved from the passenger seat area, because they had to have passengers, and were either side of the engine, there and there. OHU is interesting because it isn't in the members list. It may have been George White's car, as we'll see later on. And here it is again on the runway. What comes out of everything I've read, and what a letter I'm going to read shortly, that the brakes were superb, but they were worried about fade. So that, okay, they'd be fine for a short time, but constantly they were worried that for 24 hours, and this comes up again and again in what we're going to see. There it is, and I think that's Eric's story on the Bristol runway. That must have been before 6:30 p.m. on Saturday the 13th of June, 1953. That is Macklin and Whitehead's car, and I'm pretty sure that Graham Whitehead was driving at that stage. Now, in those 3 weeks, they painted the car, they further tested it, driven it out in a lorry, 2 or more, got through scrutineering, got through practice. The medical report said they had a lot of teething troubles, and then the 2 cars started. At lap 29, after 240 miles, the balance weight came off that car. I think balance weights we're going to probably talk about later, because it's a very involved thing. Does anyone else want to come in on balance weights now?
Counterbalance weights?
Yeah, exactly, counterbalance. Thank you very much. The second car, which was driven by Jack Fallon and Colin Wisdom, survived until lap 70 at 580 miles. So that's probably taken in early evening. The shadows you can just see on the original. But why, and again I put it to you, why did this car last 580 miles and the other one only 240? All these questions are exactly. And it seems to be, from what one's read and what Leonard Sephirate said, that Lance Macklin was pretty rough with the clutch and slid his foot off, and these reactions on the engine caused the eventual collapse of that engine. They were obviously desperate, and I'm going to read to you from Raymond Williams, who we've been talking to this week, actually emailing, so I'm calling. The crankshaft wake disaster shook the team badly, and it was through that the engine was redesigned. I understood, most likely by Dennis Sevier, with all his expertise and knowledge. When the rebuilt components came down to our shop, we thought they were from an exhibition job. The crank without the weights was shot peened, and the control conrods were different. They too were shot peened, and the cam was now gear driven, not chain. I myself never saw any of the other Bristol engines without balance weights. It was a magical job done in the shortest possible time and proved wonderfully successful for all the team's super efforts. I was full of admiration for them and still think of them. Well, now Raymond admits that his memory is not perfect, but he's pretty sure that what he said there was right. And because I'm sort of fascinated with this, I tried to work out some diagrams taken from the various magazines. Now, at the top, and this again is where experts need a big help, is the 85 engine, which has got forged balance weights. This illustration clearly shows that from the 100 on, they had these counterbalance weights that were attached with bolts. And then it goes on in another article to have this drawing of the DS1, which again had counterbalance weights, but obviously of a different sort. It's fairly difficult to see them, but they are there. They called them secondary counterbalance weights. They were not on there, and they, according to Graham Williams, other people I talked to, they were on every other engine except for these Le Mans racing engines. So it seems to me that you have these three things: 85 forged, 100 series secondary bolt-on. Very quickly after the 53 race, they redesigned, and there were no illustrations of that Le Mans race engine. I believe there are people in the room who actually got these engines. Would they like to comment at all on what they know about them? Yes, please do.
Terry Hughes. I have a Bristol 400.
Yes.
It's 1949, and my crankshaft does have balance weights on it too.
It has got excellent. Yeah, yeah. Anyone else on the 450s? Or?
Peter Mann's 6.
Yes, do get up, because you said
Peter Mann's 6-port engine has got what we believe is the original crank in the Mont Block, and that has got bolt-on weights on it.
Yeah.
But it's got oversized bearings on it as well.
Yeah, and we don't know whether there's oversized bearings or not. Has it got what I call is a large nose crank? Yes. Yeah. And is it gear driven?
Yes.
Yeah. So then you see all the elements there. And does anyone know how many other engines were gear driven cams?
Just those, I think.
Just those. So we've got a pretty special engine.
Also BS4. Some BS4s.
Some BS4. Yes, because this is where I get confused by all these BSs. And it wasn't that every BS4 was the same. They were all different ways. So, in 3 weeks, they sorted out that engine and went back to Reims and started Saturday midnight for the 12-hour race. I've since discovered that the second Charles Oxley book has got some more photographs, but there wasn't a national photograph of the last race, and that was taken from the autocar. That is 23, and it's driven by Fairman and Wilson. They obviously got it right because they won their class and had no trouble. The second car failed on the line because apparently Graham Whitehead had got his foot hard down and hadn't realised just what race he was doing, shoved it into gear and something broke in the rear axle. So that was a real success story, but they weren't entirely happy with their performance. So they decided in October to go to Morley and attack records. They had obviously cleaned up the front of the car. An interesting point is that some of the books say that they'd taken off the bonnet straps, but they're there, and again, these photographs help one to correct things which people have not got quite right. You can begin to see some of the mechanics who were involved in this. On the left, it's Ken Evans. Where are we? Probably Jack Fairman there. Billion Selby, who was asked to actually look after the 450s and was really in charge for the whole of this episode. 6 international records. They proved, I think, that the thing was reliable. But they also found that in continuous high-speed running, that the back end was not as stable as they would have liked. It's very difficult to see from this photograph, but I think that was the original back end, and they just concentrated on the front in those months before October and left the back as it was. So back to Filton after that, and you can now see the front of the vastly improved car. There are magnetic fillers for the petrol tanks. All the lights were streamlined. Let's just try to look at this, because let's just compare. If we go on to that, and then that. That is your original 1953 car. They found that it wasn't as stable as they'd hoped. Apparently, reading Leonard Setright, reading Charles Oxley, reading Emerson Fine, the car had understeer, and then at a certain stage switched over to oversteer. By changing this shape, they got the aerodynamics much, much better, so that the car was consistent. The handling was reckoned to be extremely good, and this would obviously tie up with the fact that the chassis was so good. So go back to that. That shows the 54 car completely changed, and that is that view again. You can only just see the flaps have been brought in, presumably to improve brake cooling, airflow, etc. The rear lights much better, and this swept round much tidier, different size windows. It was looking good, I think. Off they went. This was June 54. On the left, right up there, is Stephen Selby. This is one of the mechanics, and this is a figure which some of you will know or remember. Any clues who that is?
The mechanic is Ken Evans.
Ken Evans. Next door to Ken Evans is?
Don't know.
It doesn't make one bit old. There. Lawrence Pomeroy. You must have heard of Lawrence Pomeroy. Yes? He was the technical editor of the letter, and was also a classicist, and he wrote all these lovely articles about motor racing, bringing in classical quotations all the time. Interested in everything, and obviously coming down to Filton to see the departure for Le Mans in 54. Now, they were worried about that rear suspension, and what they did it was now Dave Summers doing the work on it, is they changed it to a WOT linkage. Now, this is the photograph from Leonard Seckright's book, and this is of that car, and you'll see if you look under it, that is the WOT linkage up there. And that's the medium tube. This is exactly underneath there. And they now had a car which handled well and looked good, and they were full of hope. It's worth just reflecting that why go racing in those days? Motorways were in the planning stage. There were no speed limits of any sort whatsoever. Speed was good. No computers. People wanted to get about, to develop industry, to meet their fellows. And the general feeling, because I just remember it so well, the general feeling was we're advancing by going faster and faster, and thus for British industry to develop, so much will happen. So, at the start of the 54 Le Mans, and that is Tommy Wisdom and Jack Fairman's car, 33, and Vivian Selby there. Percy Kamish, is it Kamish or Kamish? Percy Kamish. Percy Kamish is there. Yeah. And just a quite nice picture of three of the mechanics in the team. Ken Evans, Charlie Bush, and Dave Wilkins. You can only just see, but that is Gatsonides, or Gatsonides, who drove with their car into 11th place in a Fraser Nash. There are two cars, the front, Peter Wilson and Jim Mayers, and behind that, I'm sure you'll know, but that is, yeah? Exactly, yeah. It's difficult to tell whether it's Briggs Cunningham himself or someone else. Going well, that's 33 Fairman and Wisdom, and you can begin to see the crowds right massed by the track. We're a year away from the disaster, but you can see it building up. That is number 30. Number 30. That's number 34. That's Mike Keane and Trevor Line. Filthy wet. You can see that his windscreen wiper is going, and this was important because the reports are that one of the cars lost its wiper. Now we come on to the pits, and that is the 6-port head, which you can see there. Dave has kindly produced this picture of a 6-port engine. Now, who knows what that is? It's not on this card, is it? No. Well, I asked Raymond Williams, and he said that he thought it was a centrifugal steam trap. And this ties up with what we know was that the engine head had been lifting, and they certainly put another water pump on. Who is Peter Mann's mechanic?
Yes.
Do you have an extra water pump at the front?
No.
No. And do you have that?
No.
No. Nor does this. Anyway, that is definitely one of the cars, the engine actually went on. You can see the 6-board head, and as I say, perhaps one day someone will tell us what that actually is.
It's what we now call a swell pot.
Which does what?
About what you said. It's
Yeah. Well, that's like that.
Say so.
Yeah, and this is one of Percy Gamish's ideas, which seemed to work. Then Setright and Godfrey Casali talk about problems with the windscreen wiper on that car, 35. And I guess it's all supposition, but one just wonders whether they're working there to try and do something about it. You can just see that is Don Aldington, and that is H.J. Aldington, who were obviously there with their Fraser Nash. And here we are back with the rain. I always love that because it just reminds me immediately of the fighter 56 years ago. It looks as if he hasn't got his windscreen wiper. It was at this time that one was realizing that it was more than just advertising, developing cars, racing. Because I'm now indebted to Ken Oakes, and this is a result of Peter McGough, who has been in touch with, Peter McGough is here, and has been in touch with Ken Oakes in Canada. And I've been corresponding with Ken again this week. And it was about this time that Ken says that George White wondered if we could use the 450 k's version and turn it into a marketable product. Ken, was asked by W. Hobbs to investigate, and my conclusion was no, that it was very much a specialist racing car. But they had this idea, so this was talking about a possible fighter 56 years ago. The books also say that this car didn't go into the pits, and this is why these photographs were so valuable, because they said that they went on, and in fact it's completely clear. This was Jack Fairman's car. He cut the back towards the end. He did go into this, and they obviously sorted it out. The old car says, at about 3:05 p.m., Fairman hit the bank at Tetra Rouge, avoiding another car. So we're now back at Filton, and Percy Gamish, Vivian Selby, George White, Dave Summers, and that same car, which makes me think it might have been George White's. Now, this has to be an enormous success story. Le Mans 54, Jim Mayers and Peter Wilson 35, 7th, Jack Fairman, Tommy Wisdom 8th in 33, that one, and Mike Keane and Trevor Lyon 9th. When was this photograph taken? It's been in the bulletin, other people produced it, and I don't know the full answer to it. What are those numbers? I think there are people here who might have any ideas on it. What is interesting is that at the back is still the body for the 53 car, and 3 54 bodies here. So it was taken either just before the 54 race, or possibly afterwards, because they're repairing the front, which might have been the car that had come to grief. So do we assume from this that there were in fact 3 chassis, 3 bodies in the 54 style, and one chassis which was kept with the original 1953 body. We also don't know whether or not that car still had magnesium chassis and DRA. Any thoughts on this?
Well, the rear wings are being adjusted as well.
Yes.
So I would take that as winter 53.
Yes.
Post Montgomery,
Yes.
and where they are changing the bodies or building the bodies for 54. Or changing,
Yeah.
because we had
Yeah.
two cars at 53.
Yeah.
So there should be two 53 cars there.
And why did they keep what is now number one?
Well, maybe they haven't got round to it yet.
Sorry?
Maybe they haven't got round to it yet.
Exactly.
And if you look at the roofs look as if they're being panelled as well.
Exactly.
It's all part of the reshaping
Yeah.
after Montgomery.
Having succeeded in the war, they decided to advance again. 20 is the front one, which is Mike Keane, Trevor Lyon, who were 10th. 21 is Jim Mayers and Peter Wilson, and 22 is Jack Fairman and Tommy Wisdom. Number 20, by that time, in July 54, had covered a total of 3,269 miles, with apparently no engine problems at all. So they had solved their earlier problems. They knew that before that the cars were okay in short distance races, but now they knew that these engines would last a full 24 hours. Back to Filton, the victorious team, and just to run through the mechanics, Rupert Gildersleeve, Dave Wilkins, Stan Sparks, Ken Evans, Charlie Bush, and Dave Summers there. So what did they do after that? The Le Mans regulations still said that you didn't need to have a full width.
They also said that you could.
They also said that you
cover
could
over the
cover
passenger seat.
over the passenger seat.
So they seem to have realized.
So they seem to have realized that they could make a simpler car, and in some ways it was preferable to be out of the apron than claustrophobic in that small coupe. It also obviously got over the problems of the rain because they had no windscreen Wi-Fi. And there they are off, and typically George White, always interested, just there, not pushing himself forward, just in the background, watching what his team were doing. Is David Dale here? Yes. I am indebted to him because he rang up and explained about this photograph. Apparently, he was in his 403. Would you like to explain what happened?
Pulled into the garage, which was on the outer circuit of the Le Mans Road. And should I stand up?
Yes, do, yeah.
The three of us pulled in to pick up some fuel, and the garage was an Esso garage, and little old lady in the cabin came rushing out and said, "That's a Bristol." Which left us a bit surprised because we didn't think anybody knew what Bristol was. And she said, "Oh yes, they used my workshop next door to fettle the car, well, she didn't say fettle, to get the cars ready for Le Mans, for the race." And she came out of the back with some postcards, photographs, and that was the photograph. And it was a shell garage, and there were marks. When we looked around the garage, there were actually marks of shell stuff still around. And so she gave us the photographs, the postcards with the photographs on.
And we don't know whether that was behind. You never look behind to see whether that was behind The shell is so interesting because Tony Crook.
Can we go back to that, the previous one, because there was something on top which looked like
AC.
The AC on top was, is that
Where?
On the next half.
But that is surely AC's partner, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
It's just its garage of
This
the
one
farm.
was on the other garage as well as the next photograph. Yeah.
It does indicate there's a garage there.
so is AC the person? But this explains what Tony Crook is saying, that he and Roy Salvadori were originally going to drive these cars, but first of all he was too tall, and secondly, if he'd driven a shell-fueled car, he'd have lost his contract and sponsorship with Esso. 34. This is probably Peter Wilson at the pits, in the rain again. And he had actually, towards the end, let's just quickly read what the motor says. At 12 noon on the Sunday, he had worked up to 5th place. Soon after 12:30, into the pits for underbody maintenance. And we now know that the underbody maintenance was that one of the exhaust pipes had come off the manifold. And they said it was the car was very ragged, but in fact it was only the results of the exhaust. And that car averaged over 100 miles an hour for the first 12 hours. Other reports say that Selby was worried again about the brakes, and he held it back, which is why it ended up in 7th place. 32, again, you will see the crowds, and there's been a lot about the Renault crash. It happened 2 hours after the start, and I thought I'd just quickly read what the motor said at that stage. This is Pomeroy, who we've already met, and I think this is what he actually wrote at the time. At 2 hours, the race has been run at the speed equaling the previous record, but none of the leaders had suffered mechanical troubles. The Big Six Ferrari was first to refuel. Neither the Jaguars nor the Mercedes seemed to have any difficulty. Hardly had Hawthorne's Jaguar and Simon's Mercedes dashed into the pits, but they arrived also catastrophe. Macklin was forced to brake hard to avoid firing a car, and his Austin Healey swerved in the very path of Levet's Mercedes, which was going full 40 miles an hour faster. All the Frenchmen were more experienced with no avail. He struck Macklin's car, spun it round many times in the middle of the road. Worse still, the Mercedes cannoned off the bank, turned over, reared up, went end over end, then rose some 20 feet into the air, crashed to the ground, and broke in half just behind the market. The engine and front assembly rocketed over the bank into the crowd. The tail and the rest of the frame burst into flames, and exploding a cloud of magnesium stars and smoke. Some of the reports seem to indicate that more of the car went into the crowd. It seemed it was the front end that did the damage, and as we know, over 80 people were killed. So at the end, they were a little bit despondent. You can see it in their faces. That's Vivian Selby on the right, and Jack Feldman. Now they still managed to come 7th, 8th and 9th, but the Mercedes had retired at 2 a.m. when the directors of Mercedes learnt just how bad the disaster was, and so they said these cars must retire. So at that stage, the Fangio and Moss Mercedes was 2 laps in the lead, with the King and Simon 1/4. So that if they'd gone on, one has to accept that they would only have come 9th, 10th and 11th, and the 54 or more is therefore the biggest achievement. So back they went, and the autocar had written that these were going to be serious challenges workers in the future. But it was not to be. Ken Oakes says that he was about this time asked to draw up plans for what we know in the book as the Project 225. It's clear, as we found the correspondence, would have used a production replica of the Le Mans engine. The idea was it went over to Arnold's and it might have replaced the Arnold. But Arnold turned it down, and so the last possibility had gone. And now, as I said at the beginning, the balance of power was changing, and George White was really no longer in command. And what I hadn't put in the book, I found Reginald Burton-Smith's submission to the government. We believe there's a case for assistance in preserving the aero engine industry. We don't believe this can occur effectively unless Her Majesty's government will prepare to take a positive interest. We do not object to taking part in steps designed to rationalise the industry. We're already the only true example of a large-scale merger, but ask it is recognised that such further mergers must give promise of reasonable commercial benefit. It goes on, but it was clear that matters were turning. And as I put in the book, even if the 220 and the 160 hadn't got any problems, those who now were in power at Bristol were saying no more cars. So we end with a lovely picture that Raymond Williams also sent of the whole team at the end of 55. I should add that there was no last race because after the disaster they cancelled it. And there you have them. You can look at the wall. A happy memory of an enormous British achievement, and the others will talk about this car, which is the one surviving ready. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Christopher. That was excellent. We all learned an awful lot, and history is quite refreshing to digest when it's presented nicely, and someone has really got down to bring all the facts forward for you. You're very welcome to come and have a look at all the cars. Spencer Lane Jones has very kindly agreed to answer any questions that any of you would like answering regarding It's going to be a very nice lecture by James Trignell. James is one of the key trustees of the Fraser Nash archives, and he's also on the committee of the Fraser Nash Car Club. His position there really represents all of the Bristol engined Fraser Nashes. So he really is one of us, and we're really going to appreciate the rest of his talk this afternoon. So James, would you like to tell us all about it? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm one of you, but I don't pay my subs. Probably a lot of you will know that Bristol and Fraser Nash were very closely related at one time. Indeed, the first Bristol saloon, which became the Bristol 400, was initially to be called the Fraser Nash Bristol. Unfortunately, the people at Bristol didn't like that idea, which probably came from Fraser Nash, and so the idea was dropped. But nonetheless, if it had not been for Fraser Nash and its close relationship with BMW, the Bristol car and its engine would have been very different. On the other hand, if it were not for Bristol wanting to get into production after the war, there might never have been a post-war Fraser Nash at all. But first, some history. The first Fraser Nashes were built in the 1920s by Captain Archie Fraser Nash, hence the name. His company, AFN, built lightweight sports cars powered by various four-cylinder 1.5 litre engines, and they were very successful in all manner of sporting events. They're still great fun to drive today, and their unique and distinctive character is due to the fact that the transmission is by chains, one for each gear. And people who have these cars in the club are known as members of the chain gang. And those from the 50s will remember the chain gang. But you can see 4 chains, one for each gear, and then there's a small one for reverse. Solid back axle, no differential, they're fantastic. They slide through roundabouts if there's no policeman looking very nicely. Then, in 1929, a man called H.J. Aldington, Aldi for short, took over the company because Archie was a good engineer, but he was not a very good businessman, and he kept running out of money. So eventually, Aldi took over the company at the end of the 20s, and all the subsequent Fraser Nashes were made by him. For the next 10 years, throughout the 1930s, he continued to make chain-driven Nashes. And these were perfect for sporting motorists who wanted something lighter and more nimble than a Bentley or a Honda. It might be known to this audience that after success in the Alpine trials of 1932 and 1933, where Fraser Nashes were very successful, winning their class, the 1.5 litre class, they were eventually beaten by a brand new team of BMWs, which they just really appeared on the scene. It wasn't like BMW today. We all, BMW, Audi, Mercedes. In those days, BMW were a new team coming out of an aircraft company like Bristol, and that was their first sports car, effectively, and it was immediately very successful. Unlike the outdated Fraser Nashes, which were really pre-First World War technology, these cars were bang up to date with rigid chassis, independent front suspension, rack and pinion steering, and conventional transmission. In fact, very similar to an early Bristol. Aldi was so impressed that he negotiated a deal to import right-hand drive BMWs into Britain to be marketed as Fraser Nash BMWs. So this is sometimes not fully understood. These cars, Fraser Nash BMWs, were made in Germany and they were pure BMWs, but brought into England and marketed as Fraser Nash BMWs. He also incidentally was granted an option to build the cars under licence, but this wouldn't happen until the connection with Bristol after the war, 10 years later. In 1936, BMW introduced their very famous 328 sports car, which was state-of-the-art at the time. It was unbeatable in the 2 litre class. It had a 2 litre engine with a hemispherical head and the crossover push rods, as we see in these engines here. And this is where it all started. These cars were very successful up to the outbreak of war. They won the 2 litre class at Le Mans in June 1939. Crankshaft counterweights didn't fly off. They won that race, and that same car, the coupe, which has got a touring-bodied coupe there, next to the more standard-looking BMW 328, that not only won its class June 1939 at Le Mans, it also won the Mille Miglia outright the following year after war had started. When the war had ended, Aldi brought back from Germany drawings and designs, as well as permission from the BMW directors to start production of an English BMW. This, of course, evolved into the Bristol 2 litre saloon with its 6-cylinder engine. So what Aldi had was, he had the experience of importing these cars, mending these cars, selling these cars, mending these cars, servicing these cars before the war. So he knew a lot about them, and now he also had all the drawings and designs. He also brought back one of the streamlined 328s. I showed you just now the coupe, which was successful at Le Mans and won the 1940 Millimetre. The other cars, the other BMWs that ran in that Millimetre were these ones, these very good-looking streamlined cars. He was able to bring one of these back in 1945, and this became the basis for the post-war Fraser Nash, which of course would be powered by the 2-litre Bristol engine. He also, very luckily, one might say, was able to bring to England, just after the war, when Germany was not flavour of the month at all, but nonetheless Fritz Fiedler, who was one of the chief designers of the pre-war BMWs, he was willing to come and work at Fraser Nash and work down at Filton as well, developing a more powerful Bristol engine to be fitted into the Fraser Nash sports car, and to design the Fraser Nash sports cars themselves. He would have been a very successful German in the 30s, probably living quite well, but after the war they were all totally impoverished, and so he was willing to come over to work, to be able to, well, just feed himself and his family, presumably. And he was very popular at the works at Fraser Nash. Maybe not at Bristol because they wanted to do it their way, but at Fraser Nash, despite these chaps working in the factory there, having been in the war and having fought the Germans, nonetheless, they all took to Fritz. He was a wonderful man, a tremendous engineer, and there was tremendous respect when he eventually went back to Germany in 1950, and he became the chairman of BMW in 1955. The first Bristol-engined Fraser Nash chassis, so therefore the first post-war Fraser Nash chassis with a Bristol engine, as developed by Fritz Fiedler, was shown to the press at the beginning of 1948. So there it is, right at the end of 47, in the factory, and behind it is the BMW, the 1940 Millimetre BMW, which has been used as a basis for everything. The second one appeared at the Geneva Motor Show in March 1948 on the Bristol stand. Those of you who know your history will know that Bristol exhibited their new car in Geneva in 1947, first of all. Well, the second show, the Fraser Nash, this white car at the front here, with its beautiful touring, superleggera touring Himalayan body, was also on that stand. And later that year, later in 1948, it was sold to the Shah of Iran, and so for obvious reasons, we haven't been able to see that car for many, many years. We don't know whether it exists or not. That would have been fitted with one of the early development engines, which would have been an 85 series engine as fitted to the Bristol 400 and developed by Fritz Fiedler, and it was already giving over 100 bhp by that time. A third chassis was very famously hung from this balance at Earl's Court at the end of 1948, so that's the first motor show after the war, a London motor show after the war, and it weighs just 10 stone, 10 hundredweight, that's better. It weighs 10 hundredweight, and I have it on good authority, it is complete except for the crown wheel and pinion, which they didn't happen to have, it hadn't arrived for whatever reason. But that is a complete chassis, and still only weighing 10 hundredweight. So that was a big hit, and impressed the public no end. By 1949, these cars started to race. So the first major races actually came in Italy. A works development car was loaned to Dorino Serafini, who's laughing there in the passenger seat. He later became a works Formula 1 driver for Ferrari, and he had been a very successful motorcycle racer before the war. The car was entered in the 600-mile tour of Sicily and the 1,000-mile Millimetre. In very wet and windy conditions during the tour of Sicily, Serafini led all of the Ferraris and Maseratis for most of the way, but slipped off the road in the treacherous conditions and had to retire, unfortunately. Otherwise, that would have been a great victory. he also retired with mechanical problems in the middle media. So far, no success. This same car was purchased the following year, 1950, by our Tony Crook, and was the first of 3 Bristol-engined Fraser Nashes that he raced until he moved on to Cooper Bristols. Most Fraser Nashes were bought for competition purposes. They were very expensive for their time, as were Bristols, of course. Fraser Nash cost as much as a Bristol saloon, but it was just a little simple two-seater sports car. Wealthy industrialists, or sons of wealthy industrialists who had money during this period of time when everybody else was suffering from rationing, etc., went out and paid £3,000 for a car, including purchase tax, and £3,000 was a hell of a lot of money in those days. The first big success was this car, chassis number 8, and Norman Colton bought it and raced it at Le Mans in 1949, the first Le Mans race after the war, and Paul Aldington was his co-driver. The engine was detuned. By that time they were getting about 120, it was detuned to 110, and they set a steady pace, and they also found that they were a little under-geared for the circuit, so they just went out and kept it simple. Unfortunately, they had clutch problems towards the end of the race, but they still finished 3rd overall behind a 2-litre Ferrari and a 3-litre Delage. Their average speed for 24 hours was 78 miles an hour. In order to capitalise on this success, this car, which was known as the high-speed competition model, was renamed the Le Mans replica. And here we have a Le Mans replica. So if anybody ever says to you, oh, it's a replica, it's not real, not true. Fraser Nash, like other companies at that time, used this term replica, meaning the works that built this car, it was a perfect replica of the car that finished 3rd at Le Mans. So they made 34 altogether, most of which are called Le Mans replicas, but they are genuine. The pre-war chain-drive cars were called tourist trophy replicas, for instance, for the same reason. And I think Lagonda and Aston Martin, they all produced cars which had the name replica. Unfortunately today, replica means something very different to the younger generation, so one always has to explain, yes, my car is a replica, but no, it's not a replica. It gets a little boring. A more streamlined, there is Culpen in white there, RAC official, I think, in the middle, Bill Aldington on the left, brother of Aldi, and Aldi with the funny jumper in the middle, and all of the oil on his face. Because of clutch problems, he did most of the racing towards the end of the race. That's why he's all covered in oil. But it's amazing the way they dressed in those days. No flame-proof overalls or anything, just a jumper that your mother knitted. A more streamlined version of that car, same chassis, same engine, same Bristol 2-litre engine, a little better looking maybe, streamlined, and that was called the Millimedia. So they named one Le Mans and they named the other one Millimedia. Luckily they didn't use the word replica this time. So that's a Fraser Nash Millimedia. They made 11 of those, and that's the first one, and it was just about to go off to Le Mans, where it won the 2-litre class. This time its average speed was up to 82 miles an hour. That happened to be exactly the same as the BMW Coupe achieved in 1939 and the winning Ferrari achieved in 1949. Again, no loss of counterbalance weights. The 450s went considerably quicker and revved considerably higher, and that possibly was part of their problem. The cars were very successful at the many new airfield circuits, which we didn't have before the war, of course. We had Brooklands, we had Donington, a couple of other circuits, not many. But after the war, we had all these surplus airfield circuits that all sprung up, Silverstone, Goodwood, and many others. And Le Mans replicas particularly were very successful. They were unbeatable, virtually, in the 2-litre class, unless they came up against a Ferrari. And they could compete on favourable terms with much larger XK120s. I like this photo because you have Sterling Moss in the C-Type Jaguar here, and he won the race. You then have Tony Crook in the Le Mans replica, and 2 more Le Mans replicas, and behind you've got Jaguar XK120, Jaguar XK120, Jaguar XK120, etc. Loads of Jaguar XK120s, and even Ferrari. So it's one of my favourite photos. Fraser Nashes were also very successful in rallies in the early 50s. They won Alpine Cups, as they had done in the 1930s with the chain drive cars. They did it all over again in the early 50s. They won an Alpine Cup in 1951. Here is the car. and they did it again in 1954. Many famous drivers drove for Fraser Nash, or drove for owners of Fraser Nashes, because there weren't hardly any works cars, really. They were all privately owned. Fraser Nash was a fairly small company, it didn't really have a lot of money, and they did well at persuading private owners to buy the cars and race them, and get them to lend them to up-and-coming drivers. This is Sterling Moss, sitting in this car here at the British Empire Trophy, which he won. He was aged, have I written that down? I think he was aged just 21 at the time. These drivers at that time were like our Formula 1 drivers today, an inventor, if you like. So he's 21, and he was winning everything. He won the TT and a Jaguar, and he got two or 3 years running. So here he is in this car winning that race. This car looks a little tatty, looks like he could do a little paint, but we daren't touch it. It's owned by the Fraser Nash Archives. That's the leather that Sterling Moss sat on. It's pretty much as he raced it, although it has a BS1 engine in it now, whereas it would have had an FMS engine when he was sitting there then. The following year they upgraded it to a BS1 engine, which was considerably more powerful. Other famous drivers who drove these cars were Mike Hawthorne, who of course became world champion in 1958, and Tony Brooks, who was almost world champion in 1959, was just beaten, excellent driver. And they all started out in Fraser Nashes because what else was there? At that time, you had a Fraser Nash or you had a Jaguar XK 120. A few cars were sold overseas, particularly Italy again and the USA. This is Franco Cortese winning probably the most important race for Fraser Nash ever. He won the 1950 Targa Florio, and 5 years ago, nearly 10 years ago, when it was the 50th anniversary, we took a couple of dozen cars out there and went around the circuit, and next year we're going to do the same again on the 60th anniversary. He was very successful in this car. It was owned by an Italian, but he was again a Ferrari driver from time to time. He drove Fraser Nashes from 50 through to 53. He won it in 51, and he almost won it in 52 again. It would have been a follow-up win. He had a problem right at the end and didn't. If you don't know the Targa Florio, it was a race that it was run from 1906 to 1973. I think some people called it the race of 1,000 corners. Each lap had 1,000 corners. It was 40-50 miles up into the mountains in Sicily. Very, very tough race. In later years, it was Porsche really who kept on winning that race because there were really almost no straights. Suited this car down to the ground. Another Le Mans replica went off to the States and won the Sebring 12-hour race in 1952 outright. Not a lot of competition, has to be said. That was the first Sebring 12-hour race. And the Ferrari that was leading broke down, and they were second, and they ended up winning the race. That is an absolute production car with an FMS engine, bought from Fraser Nash, shipped out on Queen Mary to New York, driven down on the roads to Sebring in Florida, won the race. Subsequently, new body shapes on substantially the same chassis with the same Bristol engine were given the name Fraser Nash Targa Florio, and another one was called the Fraser Nash Sebring, again without the replica word. In 1952, as we've already heard from Christopher, we started having Bristol engines in Formula 2 single-seater cars because up until 1951, the Formula 1 was for 4.5 litre engines, unsupercharged, or 1.5 litres supercharged. It had been dominated by Alfa Romeo. Ferrari came along, first of all with a 1.5 litre supercharged and then a 4.5 litre unsupercharged, and beat Alfa Romeo. Alfa Romeo withdrew. They started beating them rather. Alfa Romeo withdrew. We had the BRM V16, which was a total disaster. So in 1952, it looked like the grid would just have Ferraris and not much else. So the authorities had no choice but to run the Grand Prix for Formula 2 2-litre unsupercharged, which is why you had the G-Type ERA and why you had the Cooper Bristol. And of course, Fraser Nash joined in too. They had their very successful Le Mans replica, so they built a single-seater body on it. Unfortunately, they only built 3 because only 3 people ordered and paid for them. The reason being the Cooper Bristol was a superior car. It was lighter and had, basically lighter, also had better suspension, and the Fraser Nash was not a success. So that was the end of that story, unfortunately. You may know the story of Spa. Ken Walton, who was a very successful driver in those days, in all sorts of hill climbs, racing, all sorts, rallies, did everything. He was fighting against Mike Hawthorne in his Cooper Bristol. I think he led him at one point. They were fighting in the rain, like this. Eventually skidded off the track, and in those days, again, safety was non-issue at all. He crashed off the track into a wood, but between the track and the wood was barbed wire, and he went under the barbed wire. It was typical of those days, like Jackie Stewart tells when he had his big accident in '66. It was just alarming. If you left the circuit, you were almost guaranteed you were going to die. So he went under this barbed wire fence, he ducked, and it took the shirt off his back. Well, Jackie got his back, but he lived to tell the tale, and then died 4 years later in Ferrari in New Zealand. Sorry about that, I just added that there. Tony Crook, again, here he is. This is his third of 3 cars. He bought that car also in '52 to race in Formula 2 races, but he ordered a 2-seater car, so he could put wings on it to race it in sports car races, or take the wings off and race it in Formula 2 races, and he did both. And there he is in the British Grand Prix in '52, the only Fraser Nash to run in the British Grand Prix. By this time, Bristol had developed the BS series of competition engines with various improvements, mainly the larger crankshaft running in larger bearings than the 85 series FNS engine. So the BS was the same as the 100 series as compared to Bristol. And Fraser Nash started to fit these engines to their cars, and some of the cars were also retrofitted with these. And whereas the FNS engine was getting 120 to 130 bhp, the BS engine started getting 130 to 140 bhp. A new model was introduced, the Fraser Nash fixed-head coupe, which was later known as the Le Mans Coupe, after it won its class at Le Mans in 1953. But of course that's the year when the Bristol 450 was introduced and failed, and although the Fraser Nash wasn't as fast or as streamlined, it nonetheless ran through, and I think everybody in the class ended up retiring, and they were left holding the baby. And for winning, they slowed down. They were getting brake problems towards the end, and so they slowed down to make sure they won the race. They still won it at 88 mile an hour, which was a new record average speed for the 2-litre class. So that was good. They did a fastest lap of 95 mile an hour. But because they slowed down and won the class, an Austin Healey 100, which was doing its first Le Mans, fairly new car, overtook it and finished ahead of it. And it's written that the drivers were quite disgusted at this, that this cheap Austin Healey had overtaken their very expensive Fraser Nash. But of course it wasn't a different class. This same car ran at Le Mans in 1954, and it finished 4th in class behind the very successful Bristol 450 coupes. This car still exists, of course, as do most Fraser Nashes, and so 2 years running, 2 finishes at Le Mans, not bad. In 1955, the following year, this is the new Fraser Nash Sebring. This is the first one made. That ran at Le Mans, has also finished. Again, it finished 4th in class behind the 3 Bristol 450s at a higher average speed of 90 mile an hour, but by that time the Bristols were achieving 94 mile an hour, so Fraser Nash couldn't compete with that. But nonetheless, fairly successful. But by now, really, Fraser Nash are coming to the end, past their prime. They were very successful in the late 40s and the early 50s, but as lighter competition came along, Lotus, Vista, Cooper, these cars were built for sprint races, whereas Fraser Nash, like the Bristol 450s, were really built for the road and for longer distance races, but even though they were very successful in short races. But here you have a typical field of lightweight racing cars, registered for the road but not really used on the road. You've got, I think it's Mike Anthony in a Lotus Bristol there, got Les Leston in a 1.5 litre Connaught there, then you've got Tony Brooks in a Fraser Nash, and behind it you've got a 1.1 litre Cooper Climax with Ivor Buick, and you can see Tony Brooks is struggling to keep up with these these lighter and in some cases smaller engined cars. So altogether, 82 Bristol engine Fraser Nashes were built, far fewer than Bristol saloons, but 82 were built between 1948 and 1955. Half of them were fitted with FNS engines, based on the 85 series. 30% of them were fitted with BS1 or BS4 engines, some with the gear camshaft drive. And the other 20% were more touring for the road, and they had either an 85 series or 100 series touring engine in it. So the love affair, call it what you will, between Bristol and Fraser Nash had come to an end. AFN moved on to marketing Porsches, for which they were importers now, and only 2 more Fraser Nashes were built after 1955, and both of these were powered by BMW V8 engines, thus completing the circle. Thank you. Any questions?